A member of my Discord gave me this idea and I just had to do it. Thank you for that, Hope to Dust. Considering the overwhelming seriousness of the last video, I want to do something rather the opposite this time around. It's what it says on the title. We're going to discuss my irrational and probably wrong fantasy and world building pet peeves that will likely, at least mildly, upset some of you, be amusing to others, and overall, it's not going to be that well thought out. All I want to qualify this video with is that these are just my opinions, this isn't all that serious, and that they don't inherently make me dislike something. Baldur's Gate 3 does like half of these things, and I still really enjoy that game, and a lot of things about its world. More than anything, do not take this as qualitative advice for what you should or should not be doing or liking yourself. I feel like that goes without saying. This is, if anything, a guide to stuff you won't see in anything that I make, and not that much more. But no point dawdling, we'll get right into it with misuse of classical archetypes. I'm starting with this one because I feel like once I explain it, it may be my most defensible, but that isn't really saying very much. By classical archetypes, I'm generally referring to things like dwarves, elves, and halflings. Tolkien didn't invent everything to do with them, but in my experience, he got the contemporary baseline vibe for what we all tend to see now, and in such a way that their designs, mentality, and use within his world all coalesce and make sense. It's one of the reasons they were able to set the standard. The elves became the epitome of a spiritual sort of creature, the dwarves are the epitome of more materialistic types, and halflings are meant to emphasize fundamental goodness and the pastoral ideal Tolkien created within the Shire. Sometimes these archetypes are modified, and for the most part that is a great thing to do. I'm doing it myself, and it's a lot of fun working these archetypes, which are so broad and useful in all sorts of ways, into your own works. But sometimes they are wielded in ways that just don't really make much sense. And here I'm thinking of a very specific example, which is slightly spoilery for Baldur's Gate 3. It has something to do with the character Shadowheart, so if you don't want that spoiled, skip ahead probably 2 minutes. So when you're going to confront her Sharan coven in Act 3 of the game, there's this Sharan halfling guarding the door. This Sharan halfling pisses me off irrationally. Even by D&D's own player's handbook, it says of halflings that most halflings are lawful good. As a rule, they are good-hearted and kind, hate to see others in pain, and have no tolerance for oppression. Shar, and Shar's worship by extent, is not particularly good-natured nor kind. It's anything but by pretty much every objective measure. Just upstairs from this hairy-footed freak, there are like 3 different torture rooms. And imagining this halfling wearing very archetypically elven-style clothing, maybe I'm too Warhammer brain-rotted, but everything Shar-related just feels like it should be populated with elves, particularly dark elves. And the idea of that halfling just torturing people is so silly that it completely took me out of the moment. I just stared at him like, what is this child with a propeller hat doing at this satanic ritual? And it dealt me true psychic damage. And don't get me wrong, this isn't some, actually they didn't follow their own lore, so it's kinda bad. And don't get me wrong, evolve these archetypes, make them your own, whatever, but if you've got elves that you treat like elves and halflings that you treat like halflings, these are very different types of peoples. And if the elf does a halfling thing, it can end up seeming silly, and especially when a halfling does an elf thing, it's going to be very silly. I can buy an elf or a human doing these torture sort of ritual things, but seeing a fantasy race that is specifically designed to be sort of childlike doing it almost sounds like it could work, but it just feels kind of silly. It's kind of why when you have orcs with green skin that sound like British football hooligans, nobody really has a problem with it. But if you make your orcs have human skin tones and look a lot more like people, just ugly, some people are going to have a few questions about what you're trying to say with them. I'm going to cut myself off though before I crash out about this particular subject and move us on to extra exaggerated designs. This one is kind of hard to nail down, and everyone probably draws the line in a different place, but generally there is a spectrum in the way things tend to be designed in fantasy worlds. This, probably more than anywhere, is where my pet peeves are pretty abstract. I'd say this should be represented with a scale, but I actually think a triangle might work better. On the top, we have literally just a real-life knight. On the right corner, we've got superhero proportions with larger hands and heads and giant weapons with spikes on them and stuff. And then on the left, we have Darkest Dungeon. This is not a good scale, nor is it representative of the expansive fantasy designs, but I'm using it because in placing myself here, you can see my preferences. I love realistic designs based on real-world weapons and armor. You're gonna hear that informing my other opinions in literally everything I make, but I also enjoy stylization when the end goal is something with a grim, shadowy, gothic kind of vibe. Every video, I tend to wear a different metal shirt. Well, today I'm wearing a Mac DeMarco shirt, but usually it's metal. But none of these opinions should be particularly surprising coming from me. It's why I enjoy Warhammer's aesthetics, and in particular Fantasy and 40k over Age of Sigmar, and never actually got into settings like World of Warcraft. Something like D&D or Baldur's Gate kind of falls in the middle for me because it can be any of these or all of these aesthetics all at once, and it's why I'm sort of selective with my opinions on settings like that. I love some things about the Forgotten Realms and really hate others. I guess this section doesn't demand a whole lot else, but it is the fundamental motivation for the way that I describe things and why I tend to reference the things I do so often. My favorite genre of media other than fantasy is horror, and considering this once again, it should check out. I'm not a particularly unpredictable person in this regard. It also goes without saying all these other aesthetics are cool and I can appreciate them, they just aren't as much for me. And in what might be my most controversial opinion, yet it's too related to the previous to not be what I mentioned next, animal people that are too people-y. This is to say, Skaven, cool, but not so much rat folk. Tieflings, cool. Yes, I know they're demons, not animals, but shut up. But not so much Dragonborn. Humans, elves, and dwarves most of all, and Loxodons least of all. Before you get the stake and torches out, let me be clear. I'm not saying the ones I don't favor are poorly made, nor that they're bad. Loxodons are actually fairly interesting. But to me, if something is styled like an animal but could physiologically wear a t-shirt and jeans, it's just a person with a costume on. More classical fantasy races are humanoid and have clear differences that help you tell them apart, but their behavior and their cultures really are what distinguish them from humans. Sometimes animal people do that too, but it's just really hard for me to see this or this and take it as seriously as I could the other types. Part of this is because why are there still elephants if elephant people exist? Where do they get thumbs from? And another part of it is that animal people always, to me, especially when they're designed to be sort of cute, to strike me as that more cartoonish type of vibe that just isn't really my thing. It's very Narnia in essence, and I think Narnia is great. But even there, the talking animals are very clearly still animals, not really humanoid in their presentation. But when you have a dragon person walking around in people clothes complaining about getting fired from being a butler at some manor somewhere, it does establish a certain kind of tone, you know? And that tone just happens to not be the one that I favor. Before we move on to our next one, a word from our sponsor. Writing is complicated. World building is complicated, especially when you're working with sci-fi, fantasy, or other speculative fiction. Keeping track of all of your relevant information from characters to countries to magic systems can be tricky, and it's very easy to get very disorganized. However, World Anvil just might be the solution to those problems. It's got a ready-made template and format for all your writing and world building needs, making it easy to get all your information down and keep it in proper order. Need templates to keep track of character information? World Anvil can do that. Need an interactive map so you can develop the unique personality of each country? World Anvil covers that. Need templates for magic systems? Need timelines? All of these sorts of things World Anvil can cover for you. I don't need to tell you that the histories of fantasy worlds can get very detailed and complex quickly, so having visuals to help you keep it all together is very useful. Altogether, it can really get you that wiki vibe where all your world building is part of a solid ecosystem, where you can jump from one topic to the next with ease and add to any given subtopic as you feel like. So if World Anvil sounds like the answer to your writing and world building needs, check them out at worldanvil.com and use the coupon code JBAT for a 51% off discount on any yearly membership. That's worldanvil.com, which will be linked in the description below. One more time, that's code JBAT for 51% off an annual plan, and thank you for not skipping. Anyway, before I get executed for my opinions on animal people, my next one is elementally / aggressively unthemed magic. This one is tricky because it is indeed basically saying that I really don't like magic systems that aren't at least a little bit elemental based. Most have different elements or schools of magic or whatever, but I really just love the thematic consistency and the general vibe you get out of contexts like a firebender or an ice mage more than out of a generic wizard, or even out of something like an evocation wizard or something like that. I'm not saying you can't still have themes or specializations in non-elementally themed magic, but to me, having that theme to ground a character's vibe and also give them clear limitations that they have to work around because they can't access other elements is just infinitely more interesting than magic systems that are more vaguely defined or more kitchen sink-ish. There can be some exceptions. I think the way a character like Gandalf uses magic is pretty good, but it's mostly because he's essentially the only source of it the way that we see it, and because he can't use it to solve the plot by himself. He's a character that we do not ever see from the perspective of, and we understand that he isn't really a mere mortal. But if you give that sort of unspecified, vague magic to a perspective character, then it gets a lot more difficult to manage and keep interesting, especially because then you get into some of the flaws that can happen when softer magic systems aren't handled carefully. Meanwhile, with characters like the Benders from Avatar: The Last Airbender, we see how these different magics work. They each get their own personalities. They inform the vibe, the design, and parts of the characters of the people who wield it. Not to mention that having these sorts of elemental identifiers are really useful for keeping who a character is and what they can do solid in your memory. This isn't really so much of a hard versus soft magic thing overall. It's more of a way of setting limitations on what magic can do for certain people that I really enjoy when it's present, to such a degree that I do tend to actively like less magic systems in which there aren't elemental limitations. In my own Baldur's Gate 3 campaign, I basically made Gale an ice mage and kept him that way, using buffs that focused on cold-based attacks, and sort of got what I wanted in the end anyway, so it was fine. I also totally do understand why systems, especially things like D&D, don't do this. Even just for the mechanical reasons of giving characters different types of damage that work against different types of enemies and that sort of thing. I just enjoy the thematic angle to a good elemental magic system too much. My next pet peeve is a little harder to express, and it's mostly to do with how fictional nations are presented. And it's mostly when something kind of tries to pull from history and does it pretty poorly. I love pulling things from history in my world building. Half of my world building is just cherry picking my favorite obscure things from history to implement into the world. But I try to do my research, and if I'm bringing something in, I either adapt it authentically where it would fit in the same way to its historical inspiration, or change it in a way that makes sense to fit the context of my world. I don't know, I guess in the end with this one, I could just say that this pet peeve is sloppy world building, but I am trying to get to something more specific than that, I think. It's like if someone wanted to pull from the history of the Norse for their northern raiders, but then gave them horned helmets and made them wear leather armor and furs only as opposed to using chainmail most of the time. But then after doing so, they claim it's a historically informed choice. Giving them the horns and the leather and the furs isn't the problem. It's also the presenting that as if that is really historically influenced when it, in the end, kind of isn't. And there is a flip side to this. While sloppy world building sort of implies laziness, sometimes in the effort to deliberately avoid tropiness or to avoid real-world history and make the most unique thing ever that nobody's ever seen before, the result is that such projects sometimes end up accidentally creating something extremely overdone by accident anyway, usually by virtue of them not actually having read very much, or creating something so impenetrable or based on such abstract concepts that it becomes difficult to grasp or difficult to relate to. Because every time they saw something that resembled a trope, they steered away and did something different just because, oftentimes sacrificing rationality or just consistency for it. Obviously, that latter one isn't really seen in published works very often, but I digress. A lot of this just comes from me resisting the urge to say, my pet peeve is when the story isn't very well written, but that isn't exactly very interesting now, is it? So I guess then that's something that definitely isn't based on quality, because excellent stories are like this one I'm about to say. is when the world building of a story or the general theme or intent of it is overwhelmingly cynical. That may seem incredibly ironic, given my tastes indicated earlier aligning more with darker settings, but there's a fine line between almost hopeless and miserable drudgery. Not to mention, just because conditions are poor in a world does not preclude there being good people in it. The Warhammer settings, when handled well, can sort of emphasize this at its best, that there can be actual legitimate heroes, and even if they can't turn the setting around, even if they can't save the world, they can still be a beacon of hope in the darkness. I think a lot of this mostly comes from my distaste for everyone in the world is evil and selfish, except me types of perspectives that you see sometimes in world building and stories. The only thing that can make that sort of thing worse to me is when it's framed by, I'm just writing realistic characters, bro. If you look at the world and all that you see are evil people, unless you're just in an extremely terrible environment, the source of your problem probably is not external. I mean, I've talked about grimderp before as a concept on the channel, where a darker story ends up going so over the top in its attempts to be edgy and miserable that it just becomes kind of funny. And what I'm complaining about here is along those same lines. I like darker stories and tones because it makes heroism in them, where it appears, shine that much brighter against the shadowy backdrop. In a world where everything is good and happy and there are butterflies and rainbows everywhere, someone choosing to do the right thing is still cool and all that, but it isn't particularly interesting or difficult. But take a world where everything does just kind of suck and where there are a lot of bad people trying to make it worse, and put that same heroic character in there, and suddenly they become this fascinating contrast against their surroundings, and you root for them and their struggle all the more. It's exactly why if you took a normal context of a father giving his kid a Coca-Cola for the first time, you wouldn't really think anything of it in our modern context. You may even dislike it because Coca-Cola isn't very healthy for a child. But when it happens in Cormac McCarthy's The Road, in a devastated world between a father lamenting the world that was and a boy who's never known anything different, that same sharing of a Coca-Cola is devastating, especially since the boy in that context knows he'll probably not get another one, and yet he still offers for his father to have some of it. I could also use the mentioning of the world of butterflies and rainbows to say that cozy fantasy is also sort of a pet peeve of mine, but like, from everything I've said and the way that I usually just am, is that really surprising? Am I the target audience for that sort of thing? No. So realistically, it's not any more of a pet peeve of mine than the existence of a Hallmark movie is. I don't engage with it, but it can continue to exist. I only even mention it because I hear people hating on the genre sort of often. I mean, I don't read it, but I also don't really care, you know? But maybe that's my other world-building pet peeve. Fantasy is such an overwhelmingly broad genre that any discourse that states, this entire subgenre of fantasy is bad, even when it is ones like cozy fantasy, which have caught a lot of flack that I don't even inherently disagree with, is just pointless. Obviously, of course, you don't need me to tell you that blanket statements about entire concepts are generally kind of stupid, but I do think the great thing about fantasy is that we can be allowed to make and consume different things within it. A good friend of mine that I play tabletop RPGs with is writing her own fantasy story, and everything I know about it indicates what she is making and what I am making have almost nothing in common thematically, plot-wise, and how characters are handled, and even regarding some of these pet peeves that I have. But does that actually matter? Not really. And in the campaigns I run, she brings in the aspects of fantasy that she likes, while I run campaigns with the aspects that I like, and it works out just fine. It speaks to the most wonderful thing about this genre. It is so individual to each person in terms of what they like about it, but so long as the fundamental conceit of, wouldn't it be interesting if this concept that could never happen in real life actually did exist? So long as that endures, it's something people with even wildly different tastes can share. And for my own amusement, all of that is said to say my other fantasy pet peeve is basically the entire subgenre of urban fantasy. Hopefully that entire diatribe above helps me make clear that just because I don't like urban fantasy doesn't mean I think it's bad. But for our purposes, I am defining urban fantasy as essentially applying to most fantasy stories that take place in the real world, but with secret magical elements in it that the protagonists discover. It's just not my thing. And I've wondered why for a long time. I like plenty of things that aren't that dissimilar. If you consider urban sci-fi to be a thing, I actually quite enjoy that. Works like Blade Runner and The X-Files are among my favorite movies and shows respectively. But urban fantasy in particular, even though I do like fantasy more than sci-fi, just doesn't do it for me. And maybe the aesthetic clash to a certain extent, even though I could see that itself being the appeal for some. The escapist nature of wishing one could escape their real life into the wizarding world of Harry Potter, for example, is like half of that series' appeal. Maybe I just don't seek that flavor of escapism. Maybe I just can't reconcile fantasy themes with more modern aesthetics. Not really sure. And it's interesting to me because I do think I usually can explain fairly well why I don't like something, but urban fantasy is just one of those things where I see it and I'm just kind of like, eh. But honestly, it could just be that for me. If you're gonna take me away from the real world, take me all the way out. Bring me to somewhere I've never been before. Don't take me to the secret witch's coven underneath New York City. Bring me to the secret witch's coven deep in the woods of a world I've never been to. But honestly, I think that about covers it. As I've been repeating, none of these are deal breakers for me, and the real value is in the self-reflection on my part. I encourage all of you to think about what your own pet peeves are and write them out, because it really makes clear why you consume or write the things you do. Anyway, that's all. If this sounds like a place you want to be, we have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos early. As we close out, I'd like to thank our patrons, Shadowrunner, Sonny, Isaac Parrott, Raymond, Don Sadako, Cavalier, and Sazabi of the Knights of the Inner Circle, Vion and Jody on Void, our Knights, and Greer, TOW, Craig, Victoria, Lauren, and Noah, our loyal squires. And remember, don't use these pet peeves as an excuse to stay all the way inside your comfort zone. Sometimes if you actually experience a few things with those pet peeves in them, you may learn something.